welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your made redundant host, Madelyn.
I'm the last one left host, Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's show. This week we're starting off by announcing that I have been laid off from Talk This podcast.
Yeah, it just seems like we're fulfilling the same job here.
Yeah, why we don't really need two people. No.
So what if it's dangerous? That's fine.
Isn't it about a little bit of danger? Isn't that desirable?
Yeah. That's what you want, isn't it?
This week it's Emma's side quest, as it will be for every side quest here and out.
From now on is always Emma's side quest.
Emma
forever.
Can make up a vaguely seasonal topic for one of them just as well as I can, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So this week, Emma, what are we talking about?
This week we're doing like a little bit of a check-in on games media. So talking about the various layoffs that have been experienced in games media and journalism. What's the talk about video game reviews? What's the talk about, relationships between developers and publishers and the people who write about their games? We've talked about like all of this before in various states, but it's one of those things that, evolves and changes as time passes. So based on various, events and discussions I've seen lately, it felt like a good time to do like a full-on check-in again for a side quest.
It's unusual because we usually make an effort that our side quests are like just out of date.
Yeah.
So I was surprised when you picked this topic. I was like, wow, Emma picks a topic that's like being talked about right now.
Heck yeah,
like,
man.
Wades into the fray.
I love that. Love being relevant.
Yeah. Well, shall we start with it's all depressing. That's the spoiler. It's all depressing. There's like no good news, really.
Yeah.
But shall we start with the perhaps most on the face of it depressing?
Yeah. Let us talk about depressing things. So the one thing that I did want to, like, that really was like, okay, we should, do a check-in and talk about this, is, over the last half a year, probably more than that or so, but in particular, there have been a whole lot of layoffs, not just in video games media, but in just
media. Well,
media,
really
media.
In the world.
In the world, yeah, also. Tech, another sector that is experiencing a lot of layoffs in particular. But there's just been a lot of media layoffs recently. And the most recent one is that Waypoint, which is the Vice Games section, is coming to an end amidst Vice possibly filing for bankruptcy as well. And that's a real bummer, honestly.
Yeah, I mentioned in our notes that here's a little peek behind the curtain of my Talk This research process, right? So first I go Google the game title, and I make sure I open up the Wikipedia page. I start there. And, sometimes you'll get interesting stuff on the first page, but if it's an old game that has had a recent new re-release, you almost always get nothing of any use. It's like, oh great, you're talking to me about the 2022 like 7th sequel of this series, and like that's not really what I'm looking for if I want to read about the 1997 original or something like that. So usually then I'll go to being like game title, show or site name, game title, site name. And while I could not always keep it in my head if the correct title of Waypoint was Waypoint or Vice Games, because I feel like it went back and forth a couple times.
It did, yeah.
But that was almost always a place where you would find the article that's like, this is like an interesting tidbit that wasn't on the Wikipedia page or that wasn't talked about in just the reviews of this, and added some more interest to the podcast. So I'm bummed that there won't be more of that, and hopefully the archive doesn't get purged. At the very least, although, given the general state of Vice, who knows?
other recent ones was the Washington Post had somewhat recently made a sort of game section on its website called Launcher that was closed down amidst various other layoffs at the Post back in January. Even earlier than that, there's stuff like Fanbyte was sold to Tencent and experienced layoffs. Fandom, the like awful ad-ridden like Wikipedia,
like worse Wikipedia
media website bought like Giant Bomb and various other websites, and then they also experienced layoffs. And a whole bunch of other ones. And you can look outside of just gaming websites and you can see newspapers and news websites going through layoffs as well.
Yeah, BuzzFeed News just totally shut down.
Yes, exactly.
All newspapers are being bought up by billionaires or shuttering or being bought up by, wealth amassing firms and then being sold off for parts, etc., etc. This is in journalism, this it's been a long-term trend, but it seems to have come for games media especially brutally over the past year or so.
Yeah, I think it does seem like in reading about it, like it comes down to like a few things. One being like just this trend of sites being bought by people who either don't know what to do with them or don't actually want them, who then, dismantle it either on purpose or through incompetence. There's some of I was reading that like advertisers are spending less money right now, and since news and media is reliant on ads essentially to exist, that means that if the ads aren't bringing in enough money, then they are losing money, theoretically, quote unquote losing money or whatever. And so they'll try to do that with layoffs, which who knew? Being dependent on ads seems like a bad business model that we just decided to do. Not
to get too much into... I'm going to try to be careful to not just be like, let's talk about the state of journalism / the economy more broadly, because obviously this ties into that, but I'm neither an economist nor an expert in journalism. And so, with that heavy grain of salt, economically, right, the reason that like tech, for instance, is experiencing all of these layoffs is that interest rates are no longer zero or very low as they have been. They're getting hiked up to deal with inflation. And so because of that, like, it's not like free money for investors to throw around anymore where they don't have to pay any interest on it. And so they're less willing to, invest at random in things, and they're hoping to actually make their money. And I lost the thread on this for a minute, but I'm coming back to the journalism side of it. It does sort of feel like, when in pivoting to online at first, these sites made a massive miscalculation in offering content for free. And while sites and outlets like the New York Times and, obviously the Washington Post laid off like the whole Launcher team, but like whatever, these sort of like established old media outlets can to some extent get away with putting it back behind a paywall and not losing their audience. People are used to not having to pay for things online, and that is the big reckoning of the web right now, right? As these companies pursue growth and growth and growth and growth, things that were free seem like they are going to move broadly, and not just in journalism, toward potentially no longer being free. And we've already seen that happen across a lot of things, but it seems like either you have to figure out a way to find that revenue stream, or the ads are just not going to support you.
Yeah, but again, moving past that, in some ways that doesn't even matter, essentially. Like ads are a good, they're spending less money, that's why they're firing people, is like a good, easy answer. But there's this one tweet that was sort of from Patrick Klepek, who's one of the main people that was at Waypoint for a very long time. That was in relation to the writer's strike actually going on, of talking about how all of these big Hollywood businesses are very profitable, but they aren't growing the way that they want. And he made the point to tie that to Waypoint and saying that Waypoint was profitable. They have a subscription model. They have people that subscribe to them and pay them money for extra content, and they make money. They don't lose money, but they don't grow. They didn't grow. They just stayed the same amount of profitable over time. And eventually that's not what they wanted, because they wanted them to be forever exponentially growing, when that's not actually a terribly realistic model to have for any business.
Well, and that's the big reckoning in tech generally right now. And, you know, journalism now is something that is in the hands of tech people, more or less, right? Is that these companies did experience more or less exponential growth for their first 10 years of existence or whatever. And further back than that, if you want to look at like a, you know, more of a computer company than like a web company. And now they're sort of reaching the ceiling of that. And also people are skeptical of it in new ways. And it just can't continue that way. There's only so many people. I mean, that's the whole thing that's happening with like a Netflix type thing, right? Let alone all of the like Uber like companies that have never made money and have been floating on like cheap investor cash forever. And now we all are gonna have to pay, you know, $200 for an Uber for it to work. It's gonna be a weird couple of years coming up.
Yeah. Anyway, one sort of unique issue to I mean, obviously the decline of media is bad for many reasons. But one sort of unique issue for like game sites shuttering is there isn't really like a mainstream discussion of games in the same way that there is of like books or TV shows or movies or whatever. You know, you'd expect to. You pointed out that there's been some like pullback on this as well, but you expect to open like your main paper and there'll be like a book review section in it. Right, like papers don't have that for games, really. Like Launcher was like a big deal because it was like the Washington Post was like, games are an actual large part of culture now, and maybe we should discuss them like we would discuss books and movies and stuff. So when you're like shuttering game sites, now there's like less and less places you can go to actually like see serious thoughts about games. Which I think is compounded by the fact that that doesn't exist has sort of created this culture of not thinking it matters that it doesn't exist, I guess. And so it's bad to see places like Waypoint Go that always have very, you know, thoughtful analyses and interesting articles and thoughts about games, versus just the Twitter ecosystem, I guess.
Well, and it's interesting too to think about, I don't know, just it like the expectations of game reviews, right? Because like I am thinking about it and I'm like, oh, it is weird when you open up the print edition of the Washington Post and there's like a game review there, right? And that's partially because, and Launcher was mostly an online vertical, but it does feel like, okay, the people who are reading the print edition are probably not interested in a review of Elden Ring. Maybe they should be. And that is something that I do wonder is, like, are people reading movie reviews broadly, even if they're not going to the movies? Right? That's another question that I have, is sort of like, that I can't answer, is who are the audiences for movie reviews and television reviews? I certainly read television reviews for shows that I don't watch sometimes, because I don't know, I just do.
Yeah, me too. But even beyond like people not reading it, you see like, you know, every once in a while there's a new article in like the New York Times that's like, did you know
people play games?
Video games are like $1 billion industry now. It's like, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
It's not just Mario jumping on those mushrooms. It's like, okay. Yeah. Like, I know that there's, like, some sense of, like, talking to the lowest common denominator, but I feel like the lowest common denominator knows that. I don't know. Somebody hadn't played Tetris before they saw the Tetris movie or heard of Tetris, so what do I know?
Like, it's true. But at the same time, you just wonder when the generational critical mass is going to tip. Right? Is the issue just that the, like, big brass at these companies are still too old to really recognize this, right? Like, in 5 years, in 10 years, will it suddenly be like, oh, the people in charge of this are people who have actually played video games and might recognize this as something that should be paid attention to? I feel like there's a possibility of that. I also think, whatever, you can make the argument of, like, good for you. Don't wade into this. You actually don't want to be a part of this. This guy, like, have you seen what it's like out there for the gaming press? Like, absolutely. I respect you for staying away.
I don't really think that's the factor.
That's a joke, to be clear. It's like, maybe the gamers get what they deserve.
You know what, fair. Gamers don't deserve very much.
But it's difficult, and to seg into kind of the second part of our discussion here, I mean, the video game review itself occupies a really kind of odd and, I think, somewhat unique space in kind of cultural reviewing more general. Both because of, like, what's expected of it, and because of how it relates to the actual product or art piece, whatever. That's already the problem, right? How it relates to the product / art piece that then emerges into the actual world.
Yeah. Yeah, games, I was thinking about this, and I think I wrote this in the notes, but, like, games really do exist at this weird intersection between, like, piece of art, piece of tech, and toy. In that a lot of games are all of those things. And, you know, there's certain subsects of movies that maybe exist on, like, the toy spectrum, maybe. But I wouldn't, all games sort of exist there. But, like, the thought process behind reviewing a piece of art, a piece of tech, and a toy are fundamentally different, right? There are different things that you would assess when thinking of something in each of those categories. But for a game, you sort of have to think about them all at once. And at the same time, the act of reviewing a game, specifically, like, you know, big blockbuster games, is so much more labor than really any other review for, like, a piece of media.
And, like, different labor. That is in some ways what jumps out to me, is it's more, and it doesn't necessarily match up with the, not to get too Vigostian here, but the labor that the player will undertake in engaging with this work. When you think about games as, to circle back for a moment before I dive into games as work here, but the when you think about games as, like, part art, part toy, part product, part tech, right? You know, given that they're going to be probably slotted into some kind of cultural section, like, yeah, you wouldn't expect to open the style section of the Washington Post and read, like, a review of, I don't know, like, a toy, right? I was gonna say a board game, but I was like, oh, like, actually, maybe that would be a good thing if they were, like, doing that. That could be interesting. But like, you wouldn't expect that, right? You wouldn't expect to open it up and read a review of a board game or a review of a, like, toy, or even, like, there are certainly outlets that do reviews of, like, iPhones or whatever, right? But I don't necessarily think that of that as the purview of, like, a newspaper, necessarily. So if you're thinking about it from that perspective, it makes total sense that you aren't seeing a lot of games reviewing in mainstream outlets, because if 75% of what you're doing is reviewing it as like a product. I mean, you're sort of doing that if you're reviewing a movie or you're reviewing a TV show, of course. There's, to some extent, you are telling a reader whether or not they should watch. But I feel like in games, it is so much more filtered through, should I buy this? Particularly because the upfront cost is higher. I recognize that's not necessarily the case with like theater reviewing or food reviewing or something like that. And I do think that food reviewing in many ways comes closest to games reviewing in sort of the space that it, the role that it potentially serves. But from that perspective, given that so many people are treating these as like, should I buy it? Should I buy it? Should I buy it? And nothing beyond that, you can understand why it doesn't get included in these sorts of things, because if it's just, you know, reviewing a product, isn't that what Amazon is for?
Well, that's sort of an interesting thing, because you do see people criticize reviews in like comments of like, okay, but you know, is it good? Should I buy it? You know, of like more sort of thoughtful critical analysis reviews that are out there. They're not necessarily giving an answer of like, is it fun? Does the gun shoot good? Or whatever. Which, valid questions, you know, but you can probably find those somewhere. But I do wonder how many of those people are actually like reading a review to like be like, should I buy it? Partially because just like gaming culture is so pre-order focused, especially for really big releases, which it's really just really big releases that get big review coverage these days. So, like, is anybody really reading a review of the second Star Wars Jedi game, wondering if they should buy it? I don't know. You know?
Well, interestingly, it sort of feels to me like, okay, the only reason you tune into a review of the Star Wars Jedi game, at least like now, right? Like if I'm reading a review of Jedi Survivor now, it's because I already know what the game is, probably, and I'm reading it to see like, okay, like how are the bugs, frankly. If you're me and you're reading it, you know, 7 months later for the podcast and deciding whether you're going to go in on it, then maybe the calculus is a little different, right? If you're someone who missed it at launch,
Sure.
and then you hear about it. But it does sort of feel like in those opening weeks, which are weirdly like the essential time, right? The people who are reading it, it's probably not really having an impact. And that actually bears out in a study that I read from the 90s, so whatever, on movie critics, in that critical response from movie critics does have an impact, seemingly statistically, on kind of the tail of a movie's time in the theater, but it does not seem to have an impact on the first few weeks when people are seeing it or not seeing it because they wanted to or didn't want to begin with. So I wish I couldn't find, there aren't good studies that do exactly that for games, and of course these sorts of things are more complicated than they were in 1997, so maybe you couldn't do a study like that anymore. But I couldn't find anything comparable to figure out for games, although just like to me personally, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. There is this thread from Luke Plunkett, who works at Kotaku, that I didn't fully agree with, but I think was speaking to like frustration on the part of reviewers in terms of how to review a game, of like you know, the Jedi Survivor, which we just talked about, came out with a lot of PC problems. There's been a rash of games coming out with PC port problems lately. We talked about that last week, maybe?
I think The Last of Us Part 1 came up for some reason in a recent podcast. I don't remember why.
Yeah. But anyway, and people were complaining that like reviews didn't talk about the bugs enough in the game and how that experience happened. And so Luke Plunkett was talking about like, you know, if you include that in a review, people will yell at you, which, I mean, I'm sorry, Mr. Plunkett, they're gonna yell at you regardless of what you write.
Yeah.
But also the more prescient point is it makes your review like out of date pretty fast, because of the way that games get updated nowadays. There was a whole other review. There was a review of Jedi Survivor, the console edition, specifically from Patrick Klepek that we mentioned before on Waypoint, rest in peace, of like he played about 10 hours of it, but apparently there was a fix coming, like the day one patch was going to possibly corrupt your save. So like they warned them ahead of the time, but in that situation, like it makes it complicated. Like, what do you do? Do I just play it and then talk about the bugs that I experienced that won't be there on launch day on the console version? And so like he played like 10 hours and then played like an hour of it post-patch and was like, yeah, sure, a lot of the issues are fixed. So like if you'd done a review of the first one and been like, there were huge frame rate drops, you know, that then were not there upon the player getting launched, then yeah, people would yell at you for that review, right? Because it's harming the precious Metacritic score or whatever.
Which I think we'll talk about. We'll talk about Metacritic. We'll get there.
And so, you know, if you're reporting the bugs in order to help make purchasing decisions, like, does that actually help the consumer make purchasing decisions? Because if all of those are gone on launch day, you know, can you really say that that's the purpose of a review? And I think that it's sort of complicated. Of like, yes, if something is really buggy, then that probably does have to be part of your review, because that's how it exists and that's how it is. But at the same time, I do understand like the frustration of not wanting that to be what your review is about, because is that really what people are coming to it for?
Well, I feel like there's kind of two elements of tension here, right? One of them is, like, you could imagine a world where this wasn't the case, basically. One of them is, because of how games reviews are written and because of how games are developed now, we have this situation of you're playing a game that the consumer will never play, right? You're playing a version of the game that in almost all situations will be worse and sometimes substantially worse than what the person reading the review on day one is actually going to purchase and experience. So we could imagine a theoretical world where like that wasn't the case, right? I mean, whatever. Harken back to earlier days of the game industry where patches weren't a thing. And, you know, like that's one element of the tension here, which we should dig into more. But the other element of the tension is just like, what is the point of the review?
Yeah.
Right? At what point are the bugs relevant to the art or the work that you're talking about? And Emma and I, am preparing for this, I feel like really struggled to find a good analog to this in any other form of media. I feel like the best, and like weird because it's like sort of the opposite version of this, but like the best parallel to this is like maybe a live television event where, you know, if it's hard to talk about if a live television like event was great if technical difficulties were something that plagued it the whole time.
Sure, but I do feel like the tension with like that is like, well, yeah, of course, you know, when you're reviewing a live TV event, you're seeing what the average viewer would see also, right? Because it was live, people were watching it live, and so they saw the same technical difficulties that were there, versus games, like, you're probably seeing technical difficulties that won't be there, or that at least the developer has assured you won't be there when the average player plays it. One other comparison I saw is like anime, like the streaming version and the home video version are usually different because they have time to make fixes because of hellish schedules. They go back and they redo things that were messed up. And so I saw someone saying like, well, it's like if you watched it streaming and then were like, I won't talk about animation deficiencies because they'll fix it on the home video. But I also don't think that's fair because, again, the average viewer is watching the streaming version.
But with a game, right, you could make the argument, even if we grant, like, okay, let's ignore the bugs that get resolved in a day one patch. Let's say we're accurately reviewing the bugs that are there on day one. Those bugs that are there on day one may not even be there on day 10, right? So the ability of games to continue changing and continue changing and continue changing is pretty unique.
Yeah.
And beyond that, right, and we talked about this some in the game's guides, strategy guides episode 2 weeks ago. I think games are also unique in that the reviewers, more than in almost any other category of cultural reviewing that I can think of, are not experiencing the game in a timeline or in a manner that it all replicates what 99% of players are going to experience, just because of the realities of when these things are released.
Yeah, I think of, like, Cuphead as a good example, because I've heard that, like, they had, like, 2 days or something with Cuphead before the reviews needed to be up. And it's like, oh, people are complaining about Cuphead being so difficult. Oh, game journalists suck. It's like, you try playing Cuphead 24 hours straight. Average gamer. See how much you like the game then.
Or it's just like you think of any, like, gigantic open world situation, and it's, you know, what percentage of players, other than, like, the most hardcore of hardcore fans, are going to finish a game the size of Tears of the Kingdom in, like, 2 weeks? Like, yeah. I can't imagine that people are getting that much more time than that to review it. I mean, I don't know. But
I mean, also, like, I don't know when they got Zelda or anything either. But, like, also, like, it feels like if the reviewer does not engage with, like, 100% of what the game has to offer, it's like, that's not a good review, you know, because they haven't fully experienced the game. Like, oh, they didn't use the crafting system in Cyberpunk, so this review is worthless. And it's like, what percentage of players engage with every system in these huge games? Like, does most players do every side quest that there is?
Do most players just mash the X button for combat?
Yeah. And so, you know, there's, like, this perspective of a reviewer can't just experience it as a average player would and give their own perspective on it. Like, a reviewer has to, like, have mastered the game in whatever tiny amount of time they were given to play, and then also write about it, or else, you know, they aren't doing their job.
Right. Also throughout, if they are, I mean, at the very minimum throughout, they have to be focused on taking good screenshots. But if they're doing a review for any outlet or in any format where video is going to be something, like, they also need to be focused on getting the screen captures. So there's just so many ways that really don't have very good parallels to any other industry, right? If I go to watch a movie... oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was thinking about, like, you know, I used to, back before the AV Club was bought by whatever company that also owns Kotaku, and their website became, like, a hell to navigate.
Yeah.
I used to just, you know, I would read their TV show reviews,
yeah.
And a lot of them are based on, like, the first third. They'll write, like, a first impression of it, and that's fine and normal. But that's not how gamers want you to write about video games for whatever reason.
Well, I mentioned that to Clickweight Boyfriend when I was preparing for this episode too, and what he said to me, which I was like, oh, okay, like, that's actually valid too, is, well, that is fine and normal for TV reviews. For most outlets, with the exception, again, of, like, a New York Times, a Washington Post that just isn't going to devote, like, ongoing coverage to a television show. Although that's not 100% true. Washington Post used to have American Idol recaps. So if it's a big enough television show, they used to do it. Anyway, but that with a television show, and this is what I would read on the AV Club, is that, like, okay, maybe you've done it, yeah, like a season preview where you've only watched the first half and you've done a review based on that. But you're probably then doing weekly episode recap reviews, and you might even do something at the end of the season, at least as a part of that last review, of talking about the season as a whole. And that's something that, like, on one hand, you sort of get in games media, and that, of course, sites continue to cover things, and if it's a big game, you'll continue to get sort of feature pieces on things as more people on the site have the chance to experience it, or people experience it differently, or, like, they just have time to write another article or something like that. But there's no equivalent in games of saying, you know, once a week I'm gonna write about what I've played of this week, in the same way as, like, me going and reading the really excellent reviews of Community or whatever, like, every week as the episodes came out.
Yeah, I think that's like cycles back to almost what we were talking about at the beginning, because, like, the big question of, like, okay, like, why did game sites have to put their review out? Why can't they do, like, a little blurb that's like, it functions?
Yeah.
And then, like, come back later and do, like, a more full review. And you do see this in some places. Cyberpunk's a good example. I remember Kotaku had, like, an initial review and then came back to it later and then came back to it later, and had some, like, ongoing coverage of, like, but that's, like, a big thing where fixes are happening a lot, right? So in some ways that's a unique case. But, you know, your question might be, why can't they just do, like, a little thing of, like, it's functional, and then come back later when they've spent more time with it and actually write a more thoughtful review? And I think that comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of these sites are funded by ads, not in the sense that publishers are paying them to write good reviews, in the sense that they need people to click on the articles that they've written so that they can get money, so that they can continue to function. And the time that people are searching for Tears of the Kingdom or, you know, Jedi Survivor is probably around the time the embargo is up and you can publish the review, because that's when everybody's publishing the review. And so if you don't publish one, you're not getting the traffic, because people lose interest over time as the next big game comes out, you know? So that's why they have to have it on time, so that they continue to sustain themselves. But it creates, like, this self-defeating cycle of the reviews can't be what you want, you're not getting, like, the full picture of the game, there's not enough time, you're crunching, but you have to get it out at that point, or else you don't have a job anymore, basically. That's simplifying it a little bit, but I do think there's a cause and effect chain reaction there that is just broken.
And then it's just, like, on top of all of that, our culture around reviews just generally has gotten really weird. Like, not just in games. Games, I think, is especially weird. But you definitely see this with, like, Marvel movies or whatever.
Down with the audience score. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. It doesn't do it. It doesn't mean anything.
It's just, like, this, like, culture of, like, we're cheering for things to succeed. And, you know, in movies, it's very much like, yes, the box office, it made so much money. Hooray. But there's this weird energy of, like, okay, it actually doesn't seem like these reviews for games that are coming out are necessarily actually influencing people's decisions. Like, you would think on the surface of it that the reason that it's important to get a review out and the reason that people are looking at things when the game comes out is because they're deciding whether or not to buy the game. But at least anecdotally, that doesn't really seem to be what's driving it. People are looking at it because they're, like, curious, or they want to be able to cheer for their favorite studio or boo for the studio that they hate or whatever. And that's really weird.
Yep.
It's a weird extension of our whole parasocial thing into giant game companies.
Yeah. I think it's sort of tied to, like, this pre-order culture again of, like, you're going to reviews because you want to feel validated for, like, your fandom around this game that hasn't come out yet. And if you go there and like, oh yeah, like of course I was right, like these developers are the king or whatever. Or if you go to review and they're like, actually it sucks, even if you haven't played it, you would be like, no, you suck, you just don't get it. You know, you didn't engage with the crafting system.
Which, to be clear, it's fine to go to reviews being like, I want my opinion to be validated. That's like a fine way to... I've certainly do that with TV reviews, right? Certainly did that with reviews of The Last of Us. Like, read plenty of reviews of The Last of Us, just like looking for my opinions to be validated, basically. So this is not to say like if you do this, you are a bad person or that is a bad thing. But it is a weird tension between what these reviews are sort of like ostensibly trying to do and what people are really actually going to them for. On top of the tension of what are these reviews trying to do. Yeah.
Also, it's perfectly fine to look at articles to validate your opinion, but if you happen to find one that doesn't and it makes you mad, my tip is close the window, go on a walk, and come back and don't send death threats to the writer.
Yeah.
If that happens to be you.
You don't have to go for a walk. Out there. The walk is optional. The rest of it.
I think it would help, though. I think that going for a walk is sometimes helpful.
But ultimately, it's just gaming reviewing is such an esoteric thing. And it just seems like barring someone pouring a lot of money into someone having an effort to do something different, it just there's no way to fix it. Games are only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and buggier and buggier and buggier up to the second before launch because they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And like there's literally no other art form where you're really experiencing something that can and often is that unfinished when you see it.
Yeah.
You know, Patrick Klepek in that review talks about TV not having necessarily full visual effects, but like that's something that you know will be fixed, as opposed to with games where you have to guess. And frankly, visual...
Although, you know, depending on how Disney keeps treating like VFX artists and writers and everybody, maybe one day movie and TV reviewers will have to deal with that.
And it's all of this is complicated even further by Metacritic.
Oh my god.
What?
I said, oh my god.
Metacritic is so interesting because, like, I feel like it's going through... It's a real cycle of Metacritic, right? Of, like, and hopefully this will lead us into our third tier here. Of, like, 10 years ago or whatever, 15 years ago, everyone was like, no, Metacritic is, like, the thing that will predict how well the game sells, right? And leading into the, like, Metacritic bonus culture that's still around, of hitting a certain score being the what unlocks the bonuses for the developers. But people were out at GDC, out all over the place, being like, every point on Metacritic is going to translate to X dollars more in sales. Which you would think, in that time period, would give reviewers, like, a lot of power, right? As opposed to, like, where we are now, where, like, any individual reviewer has, like, no power. But given that, you'd think they'd be like, oh, respect for critics, and yeah, like, bribery attempts, certainly. I loved in this article from 2015 on Kotaku talking about Metacritic, just generally, this idea of, like, oh, okay, so companies do mock reviews of their games. And people would invite people to mock review their games just so they wouldn't be eligible to review it for real. They would, like, try to invite people who they thought would be critical of the game, not even pay attention to what they wrote. It was just a tactic to say, you're ineligible now, so that's going to help our score. Just wild to me.
I mean, I imagine, like, there's something, like, morally conflicting about, like, you know, especially when this was, like, really prevalent of, like, these people would only get extra money if their game hit a certain score on Metacritic, like, and playing a game and being like, this sucks, but, like, I'm denying people the money they need to live, by saying that it sucks.
But see, that at least is not a tension that is necessarily inherent to games, right? Like you could apply that to theater reviewing, right?
Sure, yeah.
Not that theater reviewers really have the ability to close a show the way that like New York Times basically used to decades ago. But in that case too, you'd be like, oh, I give it a bad review. That probably means the show closes earlier and these people are all out of work. So like that is the one thing that we've talked about today that's like, it's pretty games unique, but it's not 100% games unique.
Yeah.
But still, here the money involved is a lot. For a lot of people who may not have anything to do with a game releasing early in a buggy state, and who like that wouldn't have been their decision.
Yeah.
But now it seems like companies are maybe in their pivot to influencer culture, at least at, Embracer Group, are starting to pay some lip service to not caring so much about Metacritic.
Well, I do think it has less power than it did, 5-10 years ago. If only because there are much fewer places that actually give a number that Metacritic can, like, put a plug into their algorithm or whatever. Like, over the past 5-10 years, a lot of places have moved away from number scores, which I think has taken some of the power out of Metacritic. And also, I saw there was some article like a week or so ago that's like, Metacritic is stepping up their moderation. And a lot of the responses were like, there was moderation on Metacritic? Are we sure?
Who knew?
Because now, like, the audience score is just like, it's just where you go to have your culture war for whatever reason. You just go there and leave a bad review because, like, I don't know, there's gay people in it. There you go.
Well, given the prevalence of Metacritic, the way the games companies put Metacritic on a pedestal, it's sort of no surprise. So that brings us to the relationship between these companies and between reviewers. What should it be?
So this was sort of brought up because Nintendo has Kotaku blacklisted from early access to their games, and has for a while. So they were saying, hey, we won't have a review for Tears of the Kingdom because Nintendo still won't send us their things early. And because there's weird hatred towards Kotaku, the gamers celebrated. And I mean, I think Kotaku's website interface sucks to all hell, but I don't understand the, like, online fervor against
It's about
Kotaku.
ethics, Emma. It's ethics in
I
journalism.
mean, yes, I do. It's leftover from Gamergate, but whatever. And then pretty soon after this, Tears of the Kingdom leaked. And if you didn't know, the game was sold early.
As games always are.
Yes, as games always are nowadays. This one's, like, particularly bad. It's not even like people, like, found their way in somehow. It's like people were just like, here you go. They're selling it early. And people were even up to, like, streaming it and, like, all this sort of stuff, which, like, you're taking their lives in God's hands there. Nintendo, Reggie is coming to murder them.
Literally.
He said he is. He tweeted it out. He said, I'm coming to murder you. I'm not even joking, really. And then Kotaku reported both that the leaks are happening and did a summary roundup of some of the stuff the leaks included. And you can, there's some argument to be had of, like, is that a good article to write for various reasons? But the main thing seemed to be, like, they're attacking Nintendo. Like, no wonder Nintendo doesn't give you early access to their games. You're writing about their leaks. And it's like, Nintendo's fine. The one meme of like the corporate company and like the Simpson guy, like weird internet randos, that will always be eternal. Of like, so what if Tears of the Kingdom leaked? Like, and this doesn't have spoilers in like the headline or the description or anything. Just don't click on it if you don't want to know. But it's news, and it's just that, you know, their marketing plan went wrong, right? But that's news, and it shouldn't be Kotaku's job to protect Nintendo from their marketing plan going wrong. But it seems to be some people's opinions that it is. That there should be some, like, I guess, respect there? And it's not that there shouldn't be respect, but, like, there shouldn't be, like, bootlicking either. I don't know.
Yeah. It's especially difficult, interesting, because this whole episode just me being like, let's talk about other media, right? But there's not really any equivalent media where the company has quite so much power, I would say, as in games, because as we've been talking about, right, it's already a nightmare task to get your review done for the launch window if you've been given your week and a half to play it or whatever. But if it's especially for games that are huge, like Tears of the Kingdom, if you get it day one with the consumer, even if you are blowing through it literally as fast as you can, you're still going to miss the real window. And it's hard to think of any other media where that sort of gatekeeping is possible, right? Like, you think the worst case scenario maybe is like, yeah, you don't get to see TV episodes in advance, but you can, you know, we've all watched a season of TV in a day before. You can do that with everyone else and still get things out in time. And that would suck, but you can do it. And for a book, for a play, for a movie, if you're not invited or whatever, and in many of these cases, like, it would actually sort of be unethical for you to have been invited, right? I read something about, you know, like food. The LA Times posted something about like what their food critics hold themselves to as ethics standards versus what food influencers may or may not hold themselves to. And it's like, oh, like, actually going as a critic where you've been invited in that case is like unethical, basically, if you're going to consider yourself to be like a journalist, because food critics typically go to pretty extreme lengths to try to avoid being recognized. They don't get special treatment, and sometimes they still get recognized, and they still do get special treatment because those people are like known. But they pay for their, like, the newspaper pays for the food, right? The restaurant doesn't comp them the food. And, you know, there's, in all of that, you can go on your own. You don't need the, like, developers, the creators' permission to go and engage with the work. But because games are so huge, and because their window of relevance for these sites and for keeping these sites alive is so small, it puts you in a weird power dynamic, in that the developers have the power to, like, shutter a site. Right? We talked about this with game guides 2 weeks ago too, right? Yeah. Of, like, they did that horrible Final Fantasy guide because you couldn't lose Final Fantasy. Like, that would be it.
Yeah.
And so, given that, and like, on the flip side of it, there is no gaming outlet who is so powerful that a publisher deciding, I'm actually not going to send this to this person, will have any impact in the AAA space.
Well, because it's unfortunate that at least the main thrust of online gaming community is almost always on the developer's side. Somehow we've gotten into a state, thanks partially at least to Gamergate situation, where people are just anti-game reviewer as a rule. For whatever reason.
They get paid to play games, Emma.
Yeah, so part of the other reason I want to talk about is I did just finish reading a book called Bullshit Jobs by David Greiber. And one of the subpoints in that is it seems like, with a few exceptions, like in Western society, the way that we structure jobs is like the more fulfillment and feeling of impact that a job has, like the more you get satisfaction out of doing something or feel like your work matters, the less you get paid and the less respect you get, because everybody has to have like their fair share of the suffering, essentially. Versus people who do jobs that are pointless, and they probably know are pointless and are soul-sucking and destroying, they get more respect and more money because their suffering is coming from just doing the work that we've decided, you know, they have to at least pretend to be doing work in order to be given a livelihood, essentially. And, you know, a lot of these things are like, you know, people like teachers and nurses and cleaners don't get very much respect or money, even though they're making an impact. But you can extend that out to, like, people who are doing creative fields or engaging with creative works. People are saying, you get to play games, you get to think and talk about games, you get to have intellectually stimulating stuff to do. And so, you shouldn't be paid very well for it. 2, you shouldn't have any job security. And 3, I get to hate you. And somehow we've set up this society of, like, if we perceive that a job would be fun or intellectually stimulating or meaningful to society, like, that's their reward. They get their intrinsic reward, and everything else has to suck because they get that. And I think that's an interesting point of view to apply to things like game reviewers, right? Of, like, there is this perception, like, that's a cool job. And, like, it should be. It should be a cool job, but everything surrounding it is so awful that it's like some made-up trade-off in exchange for having a cool job. You know?
So let's hand it all over to the influencers then.
Talk about unethical. You know, I watch streamers and stuff, but, like, they can just get sent gift boxes.
Influencers don't have to be unethical.
Yes.
And many of them are not.
Yes.
There's just nothing stopping them from being.
Yes. You'll see, you know, people get, like, gift boxes of stuff, like special gift boxes of stuff, or they'll be sponsored to play the game. And theoretically, the sponsor doesn't mean that they can't say bad things about the game, right? But it's still, like, influencers exist more in the gray zone, and you could say reviews exist here too, just because, like, reviews have to keep the site alive through keeping people coming. But influencers especially are, like, the gray zone between, like, reviewing a game and marketing a game. And yet, there's more feeling, I guess because you can see their face, or, like, hear their voice, or you think parasocial relationships. I don't know, there's, like, a greater feeling of trust in influencers, for whatever reason.
Well, I think it's because, like, most of these influencers' entire job isn't pay-to-play reviews, whereas
Sure.
the hatred directed towards game reviewers, particularly at certain sites, like, weirdly gets them even more cast as, like, pay-to-play reviewers or pay-to-hate reviewers or whatever. So it's, yeah, because you feel like you're friends with the influencer, or, like, you've chosen them because you agree with their opinions or something like that. It feels different.
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, like, the ultimate solution for game reviews is, like, having to find some way that is financially sustainable without having to rely on day one reviews. But what is that? What's that model? Is it possible to do it when everything else is based on the other model? I don't know.
Well, in my dream world, the influencers are able to take over the day one stuff, which is just about people looking for whether their opinions have been validated or not anyway, right? And it's like, in some senses, like, okay, like, an influencer is probably a better source for that. Yeah, agreed. If that's what you're looking for, then this is where you're going to find it. And yeah, there have been a few, Like, people are kind of grumpy at influencers right now because Redfall was bad. And that was not how it was necessarily portrayed in some of the pre-release stuff. So, you know, this is gonna come for them next, no doubt. But right now, it's still possible to make a bunch of money on Twitch and a bunch of money on YouTube, sort of, and support yourself that way, and have people still like and respect you, sort of, anyway. I mean, you have to call yourself an influencer, so there's a trade-off there.
Yeah.
But, you know, in my dream world, yeah, they could take over that part, which they're better at anyway, thus freeing the one video game site that will still survive at that point to be able to write some more interesting stuff, because they don't have to be like, let me talk to you about the frames per second or whatever. They can just dig into the weird stuff.
Yeah.
That won't happen because there's no money, but...
Yeah.
But I think, I don't know. Here's my hot take. Here's my hot societal take of the episode. I just think that that's where culture is going. I think journalism is thrashing around, and in ways that don't seem to, like, it's just like circling the drain in ways that don't seem to have a solution. And that means that, and that's not just in games. Like, that's in, like, you know, book influencers on TikTok have a lot more influence than book reviewers anywhere. Food influencers on TikTok have a lot more influence than all but the very most high-profile food reviewers. I mean, I imagine if you go outside of, like, New York, food influencers have way more influence than anyone else, right? And I don't know. I can't speak to TV and movies exactly because that feels like a weirder, more broad category in general. But I wouldn't be surprised if it moves that way as well. So I just think this is all going to get handed over to influencers for better and probably for mostly worse. And I don't know, maybe journalism will crawl out of this hole 10 years from now or something like that. We'll see. That's my depressing hot take.
Well, you can even say, like you put in here, like Twitch and YouTube are becoming less and less sustainable ways to make money too. So even people, and TikTok's not a very sustainable way to make money either, especially since it's on a perpetual state of being banned anytime. So even like influencers are going to run into this problem where they're just not making enough money to sustain themselves eventually.
Aren't we all? Aren't we all going to run into this problem?
Yeah, right, you're right. Aren't we all going to run into this problem?
And that's, you know, that's a whole other episode. That's a whole other
At least
episode.
my taxes aren't complicated. How about that?
You have easy taxes. Well, on that hopeful note, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
Well, listeners, if you want to wish me well on this, my final episode before being laid off from the show, if you have non-toxic thoughts on gaming journalism, or on why do you read reviews early on when something comes out? Are there sites that you follow? Are indie sites somehow the way of the future? Can Patreon save us? It cannot. But maybe. You never know. When will real patrons return? And would that's probably bad too. Do you have a solution to the problems facing journalism right now? You could share it with us on social media if you want. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. If you have a solution to the problem facing journalism, or even just games journalism, maybe you should share it in a different way than that. But, like, tag us, at least. Yeah. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read about the show, check out the games in the hat, read our blog, and finally, if you enjoy Talk This and you want to help sustain our endless exponential growth that is required for the podcast to continue, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts, wherever you found the podcast today. Go ahead and subscribe to Talk This. Next week we got some games.
I believe it's Skies of Arcadia and Tunic.
It was definitely Tunic. Right, because I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
And then in 2 weeks, it'll be our Save Data show, wherein I will give you my thoughts on the entirety of the Trine franchise.
See, that's what we can do. We can give you thoughts on Trine, because we're not tied to AAA releases, I guess.
Trine is a AAA in my book. Stay tuned for thoughts like, it's not as janky now and it sucks.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
I've already been crafting my overview of this series. I was talking about it on the way to the farmer's market today. It's great. Trine occupies my every thought. Anyway, listeners, that's our show. Thanks for listening. Emma, do you have a hopeful sign-off? A sign-off full of light and hope?
This week, I hope that all of your opinions are correct. Objectively.